In India, movement has always been ordinary. People leave, return, circle back, and leave again. Roads remember footsteps longer than houses remember walls. Staying still has never been the default. Moving has been a rhythm of life. We grow up hearing stories of journeys. A grandfather who arrived by train with a steel trunk. An aunt who crossed districts for work. A cousin who never fully came back. Migration sits quietly inside family memory. For many, home has never been a single place. It is stitched together from villages and towns, rented rooms and borrowed addresses. Home becomes something you carry, not something that waits for you unchanged. Even those who never moved have been shaped by movement. The neighbor who left, the remittances that arrived, the accents that shifted, the festivals that felt slightly emptier. Migration touches lives without asking permission. In everyday conversations, migration appears casually. He's working outside. Shall come during holidays. They've settled elsewhere. These phrases sound normal because they describe a normal condition, not an exception. Across generations, movement has been a way of coping and hoping. It has been about survival, ambition, duty, and sometimes escape. Rarely dramatic, often exhausting, migration is woven into ordinary Indian time. Tonight, we begin by listening to migration, not as disruption, but as continuity. Not as a break from life, but as one of the ways life in India quietly keeps going. Long before modern borders, movement shaped the subcontinent. Traders followed rivers and winds, carrying spices, cloth, and stories. Routes were not lines on maps, but habits, repeated until travel felt familiar. Pilgrims walked for months, sometimes years, across forests and plains. Sacred places were connected by footsteps. Faith moved bodies, and bodies carried ideas, songs, and customs back home, quietly reshaping the local world. Agrarian life also depended on motion. Seasons pushed people to new fields, new landlords, new settlements. Land was worked, left, returned to. Farming itself taught families that stability often required periodic movement. Labor followed opportunity wherever it appeared. Quarries, ports, plantations, factories. People arrived, stayed briefly or long, and moved again. Work sites became temporary villages, full of languages learning to coexist. A traveler once observed that India felt like a land where people were always arriving and departing, as if motion itself was part of the climate. The observation still feels uncannily accurate. Then came a moment when movement was forced, hurried, and heartbreaking. Families crossed in fear rather than hope. Trains carried silence and loss. Migration, once familiar, suddenly carried the weight of rupture. Yet even after that wound, movement did not stop. Life reorganized itself around journeys once more. India continued to breathe through motion, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, always forward, never entirely still. Migration in India rarely follows a single direction. Some journeys move from fields to cities, others from one city to another. Movement adjusts itself to opportunity, pressure, and chance rather than neat patterns. Rural lives often brush against urban ones. A person leaves a village for a city, but the village never fully leaves them. Phone calls, remittances, and return visits keep both places alive together. Cities also exchange people among themselves. One job leads to another. One rental contract ends. Another begins elsewhere. Urban migration feels less like arrival and more like continuous recalibration. Some movement is seasonal, tied to harvests, construction cycles, or weather. People leave knowing they will return. The journey becomes routine, almost domestic, repeated year after year with quiet resilience. Other journeys stay within state boundaries, barely noticed by policy, but deeply felt by families. A district over can feel like another world, even when the language remains familiar. Some crossings stretch across states, languages, and customs. Names are mispronounced, food changes, habits shift. Belonging becomes flexible, negotiated daily through work, neighborhoods, and shared survival. Institutions like the census and the NSO occasionally pause to notice these movements. Their observations confirm what households already know. Migration is not rare or exceptional, it is everyday and widespread. Taken together, these movements do not form categories so much as overlap. People move in layered ways, sometimes at once. Migration becomes less a type of journey and more a condition of living. Rural, urban migration is often spoken of as a leap, but it usually begins as a hesitation. Thought planted by dwindling work, rising costs, or a sense that effort might travel further elsewhere. Cities appear as promise from a distance. They seem to offer classrooms, hospitals, steady wages, and choices unavailable back home. Aspiration quietly gathers around bus stands, railway platforms, and borrowed phone numbers. Education pulls families toward towns and cities. A school with better teachers, a coaching center, a college seat. Migration begins not with ambition alone, but with responsibility toward the next generation. Work, too, exerts its gravity. Construction sites, workshops, delivery routes, kitchens, offices. Urban labor absorbs people unevenly, often without ceremony. Survival precedes success, and dignity is negotiated daily. Studies and reports speak of urbanization trends and expanding cities. They describe growth corridors and swelling populations. But behind these narratives are individuals counting shifts, rent cycles, and return tickets home. Cities rarely receive migrants gently. Housing is fragile. Work uncertain. Belonging conditional. Many arrivals learn quickly that the city tests endurance before offering stability, if it offers it at all. Still, people stay. They adapt accents, share rooms, build networks, send money home. The city becomes livable, not because it is kind, but because people make space within it. Rural. Urban migration is neither triumph nor tragedy alone. It is a slow negotiation between hope and hardship, played out every day in crowded trains, temporary homes, and dreams that refuse to settle quietly. Some migration does not aim to arrive. It moves in loops. People leave, work, return, and leave again. The journey is planned, temporary, and quietly folded into the calendar of survival. Agriculture often sets this rhythm. When fields, rest, or rains fail, people travel outward. When sowing returns, they come back. Movement becomes a seasonal extension of rural life, not a departure from it. Construction sites absorb these cycles. Workers appear, build rapidly, and vanish before neighborhoods remember their names. Cities rise on labor that arrives predictably, yet remains socially invisible. Brick kilns follow similar circuits. Families relocate together for months, shaping days around heat, quotas, and repetition. When the season ends, the kiln empties, leaving little trace of those who powered it. Informal labor thrives on this circulation. Markets, factories, transport hubs depend on hands that are present only briefly. Work is available precisely because workers are not expected to stay. Government and international reports occasionally acknowledge these patterns. They speak of estimates, flows, and mobility. But much of this movement slips between categories, seen only when it briefly disrupts routine. Seasonal migrants rarely demand attention. They blend in, work, adapt, and move on. Their absence is as unremarked as their arrival, making invisibility their most consistent condition. Circular migration reminds us that movement is not always about escape or settlement. Often, it is simply how people keep life running, quietly, repeatedly, and without leaving permanent marks behind. Work shapes the migrant experience more than movement itself. Jobs are found through word of mouth, contractors, or chance. Employment begins quickly, often without paperwork, clarity, or long-term assurance. Many migrants work without contracts. Wages are negotiated verbally, hours stretch quietly, and terms shift without notice. Informality allows work to exist, but it also keeps workers perpetually uncertain. Housing mirrors this instability. Rooms are shared, temporary, and easily withdrawn. A missed payment or job loss can mean sudden displacement, turning shelter into something constantly renegotiated. Access to health care remains fragile. Long work hours discourage clinic visits, documentation feels intimidating, and illness risks income loss. Care is often delayed, improvised, or avoided altogether. Exploitation rarely announces itself dramatically. It appears as unpaid overtime, withheld wages, unsafe conditions, or debt that quietly grows. Power imbalances settle in through routine, not spectacle. Labor surveys and committee reports occasionally narrate these realities. They describe informality as structure rather than exception, noting how systems depend on flexibility that workers alone must absorb. Despite this, migrants develop strategies. They share information, rotate risks, pool savings, and lean on community ties. Survival is organized collectively, even when recognition remains individual and uncertain. Work, for many migrants, is neither stable nor temporary, it is provisional. Life is lived between payments, renewals, and next steps, with vulnerability managed daily, not always resolved, but rarely ignored. Migration reshapes identity slowly. Accents soften or sharpen, habits shift, food changes. People learn when to explain themselves and when to stay quiet, adjusting daily to unfamiliar expectations. Language becomes the first negotiation. Words are learned for work, survival, politeness. Mispronunciations invite humor or hostility. Fluency offers access, but never complete erasure of difference. Culture travels unevenly. Festivals are celebrated differently, rituals shortened, customs adapted to shared spaces. What is kept becomes precious. What is dropped is rarely forgotten. Discrimination appears in subtle forms. Rental refusals, job preferences, casual remarks. Belonging is often conditional, granted provisionally, and withdrawn easily when anxieties rise. Regional tensions surface during moments of stress. Economic pressure turns neighbors into competitors. Migrants are asked to prove loyalty, contribution, and restraint, even while performing essential work. Courts have occasionally observed that cities depend on migrant labor, even as they resist migrant presence. The contradiction is noted calmly, without fully resolving its everyday consequences. Sociological studies speak of integration as a gradual process. Over time, shared routines soften boundaries. Familiarity reduces fear, though it rarely eliminates hierarchy or memory. For migrants, belonging is rarely absolute. It is layered, situational, and negotiated. Identity becomes less about origin and more about learning how to exist, imperfectly, in multiple places. Migration within families often looks different from migration alone. Women and children move for reasons that are less visible, folded into marriage, caregiving, and household survival rather than explicit economic choice. Marriage remains one of the most common reasons women migrate. A new home, new city, new language sometimes. Identity shifts overnight as women learn to belong in unfamiliar households and neighborhoods. Care work pulls women into cities quietly. Domestic labor, childcare, elder care. Work that requires trust more than contracts, and invisibility more than recognition. Movement here is steady, but rarely acknowledged as migration. Children move alongside adults, often without being counted. Schools change, languages shift mid-sentence, friendships reset. Education becomes uneven, shaped by transfers, documentation gaps, and temporary living arrangements. Some children stay back, growing up with grandparents while parents work elsewhere. Family life stretches across distance, sustained through phone calls, remittances, and periodic reunions that carry both joy and strain. Concerns around safety follow migrant families constantly. Women adjust routines, clothing, routes, and silence. Children learn early where they can go and where they should not linger. Surveys like the NFH and child welfare reports occasionally note these patterns. They describe nutrition, schooling, and health in motion, revealing how mobility complicates care without always disrupting it completely. Family migration shows that movement is rarely individual. It redistributes responsibility, reshapes relationships, and quietly asks women and children to adapt first, and most often, without being named as migrants at all. Access to welfare often depends on staying put. For migrants, movement complicates entitlements that assume fixed addresses and stable paperwork, turning everyday survival into a series of administrative negotiation. Ration cards illustrate this tension clearly. Food security exists in principle, but access can pause mid-journey. A family may be eligible everywhere, yet able to claim benefits only somewhere. Health schemes face similar friction. Treatment is promised, but portability lags behind practice. Clinics ask for documents that migrants may not carry or that belong to another place entirely. Documentation becomes a quiet barrier. Proof of residence, identity, or employment is often missing, outdated, or mismatched. Each gap delays access, making rights feel conditional rather than guaranteed. Recent policy efforts have tried to respond. Systems now speak of portability and universality. The language has shifted toward recognizing mobility as normal, even if implementation still trails behind intention. The Supreme Court of India has occasionally noted these gaps. Its observations reflect an awareness that welfare cannot remain tied to immobility in a country defined by movement. For migrants, accessing welfare is rarely dramatic. It involves repeated visits, explanations, and waiting. Success arrives quietly, as relief rather than recognition. This relationship between migration and rights remains unfinished. As people continue to move, systems slowly learn to follow. Access improves not through grand reform alone, but through gradual alignment with lived mobility. Migration usually remains unnoticed until crisis interrupts routine. Suddenly, movements that were invisible become impossible to ignore. What was normal becomes newsworthy, not because it is new, but because it stops working. Economic shocks expose fragile arrangements. When work collapses, overnight, migrants lose income, housing, and certainty at once. Journeys that were once planned become urgent, improvised, and exhausting. Natural disasters have long revealed this dependence. Floods, droughts, cyclones push people out temporarily, sometimes permanently. Relief camps fill with those whose mobility had always kept them just outside formal safety net. Recent nationwide disruptions brought migration into sharp public view. Yeltsin outside cops doctors outdoor. Highways filled with walkers, stations emptied, shelters overflowed. The country paused long enough to see who usually keeps it running. News images and headlines briefly followed migrant journeys. Stories were told, statements issued, concern expressed. For a moment, mobility was acknowledged as central, not peripheral, to everyday economic life. Yet these moments were not exceptions. They stripped away the quiet systems that normally absorb migrant vulnerability. Crisis revealed what routine had long concealed. When transport resumed and work returned, visibility faded again. Migrants dispersed back into cities, work sites, and in informal settlements. The extraordinary dissolved back into the ordinary. Crisis does not create migration. It simply interrupts the rhythms that hide it. In those pauses, the country glimpses a truth it already lives with. Movement is constant, even when recognition is not. Law and policy often arrive late to migration. Systems were built assuming stability, then asked to adapt to movement. Governance responds gradually, learning to manage lives that do not remain in one place. Labor laws have long struggled with informality. They imagine employers, contracts, and fixed work sites, while migrant work moves across contractors, locations, and timelines that resist neat regulation. Interstate migration legislation attempted recognition. It acknowledged movement across borders, registrations, and responsibilities. Yet implementation remained uneven, weighed down by administrative distance from everyday work sites. Committees periodically revisited these gaps. Their reports spoke of portability, coordination, and inclusion. The language became more aware, even as ground realities continued to outrun formal frameworks. Recent labor codes sought simplification. They promised consolidation and clarity, but also raised questions. Migrant protections appeared within broader reform, sometimes losing visibility amid structural change. Judicial nudges occasionally pushed administration to respond faster. Courts reminded governments that mobility could not suspend rights. These interventions were corrective, not transformative, urging alignment rather than overhaul. Governance challenges remain practical. Coordination across states, data sharing, last-mile delivery. Migration test systems designed around territory asking them to follow people instead. Law, in this context, is not absent. It is incomplete. Policy learns through friction, adjusting slowly to a country where movement is ordinary, constant, and unlikely to ever settle neatly within administrative lines. Migration invites us to rethink what India means. Unity here has never required sameness. It has grown through movement, encounter, and adjustment, allowing difference to circulate without dissolving the idea of belonging. Diversity in India is not arranged neatly by region. It travels. Languages, cuisines, customs, and skills move with people, quietly blending into new places without erasing where they came from. Mobility complicates identity, but it also deepens it. A shared citizenship must stretch across accents and addresses, recognizing people not by where they stay, but by their participation in common life. Rabindranath Tagore once imagined India as a place where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. Movement keeps testing that imagination, sometimes straining it, sometimes renewing it. Migration reminds us that national life is relational. Cities depend on villages, regions on one another, work on unseen journeys. Interdependence is not abstract. It is lived daily through movement. Belonging, then, cannot be territorial alone. It must be ethical, extending recognition across distance. The idea of India grows strongest when it accommodates those who arrive, stay briefly, or move on. To think of India without migration is to imagine a stillness that never existed. The country holds together not despite movement, but through it, through countless journeys that quietly affirm a shared if unfinished citizenship. Migration, seen closely, is not a crisis interrupting normal life. It is normal life adjusting itself, quietly, repeatedly, to changing ground beneath people's feet. People move not because they want disruption, but because stillness sometimes becomes impossible. Movement becomes a skill, learned over generations, refined through necessity rather than choice. Adaptation sits at the heart of these journeys. New routes are memorized, new rhythms learned, new homes improvised. Survival does not announce itself loudly, it settles into routine. Hope, too, travels lightly. It fits into small expectations, a steadier income, a safer school, a little more certainty tomorrow than yesterday. Migration rarely promises more than that. For most, movement is neither heroic nor tragic. It is practical. It is tiring. It is sustained through shared meals, borrowed spaces, and conversations held across distance. When we listen carefully, migration sounds less like upheaval and more like breathing. Inhale, exhale, leave, return. A continuous adjustment to life's uneven terrain. Perhaps understanding migration begins by letting go of urgency, by seeing journeys not as emergencies to be solved, but as realities to be lived alongside with patience. So tonight, we leave this thought open. People will keep moving. Life will keep rearranging itself. And somewhere, quietly, another journey will begin.